We ended the last video, which was our first on Spinoza's ethics, part 1, with his conclusion in proposition 15 that whatever is in God. In the second half of the first part of the ethics, Spinoza will draw out the most important immediate consequences of this view that whatever is in God. And I've summarized these consequences here that we'll be going over today in the video. So we can look at these really quickly and consult them for reference. The first is that God is the cause of everything that exists, both its existence, or that it is, and its essence, or what it is. This causation takes the form of absolute necessitation. That is, all the effects of God follow in the same way that logical consequences follow from a definition. Or, as Spinoza would say, they follow in the way in which, from the definition of a triangle, it follows that a triangle has 3 sides. So it's a very strong sense of causation, a logical necessitation view of causation. This causation also is immanent, not transitive. That is, unlike in traditional Abrahamic religion, God does not stand as an external transcendent cause of his creation. All effects for Spinoza are effects in God itself. So Spinoza describes them as modifications of God or expressions of God or God's nature. The effects are layered in a structured way, such that they can be ordered into more direct and less direct effects. And you see here the more direct to the less direct in these 3 items that I've listed here. These will be obscure right now, but they'll be clear as we go through. First of all, there are those immediate expressions of God's absolute infinite nature itself, which are infinite and eternal. These are called the infinite modes. There are immediate infinite modes, and then there are mediated or mediate infinite and eternal modes, and these exist as modifications of these immediate modes. Again, this will become clearer as we go through the text. And then third, there are the finite modifications of God, finite modes, and we can say right away that these correspond to particular things, what commonly we would call particular things. These, in Spinoza's view, are not caused directly and immediately by God or his attributes, but rather they're approximately caused by a preceding finite modification or other particular thing. So this particular thing is caused by a still preceding particular thing and so on to infinity. So you get a picture like this one here, where you have an infinite series. That's what the infinity sign signals here. And then you have, in these series, you have finite modes that are causing other finite modes. Of course, ultimately, this series itself is going to flow from God itself, but not immediately or directly, but through the infinite eternal modes of God. And we'll see how this works out, again, as we get through the text. So we get a picture according to which the infinite modes, immediate or mediate, of God flow logically directly from God's nature and exist from all eternity. Well, the finite modes, the particular things, exist only for a finite duration, but they're lodged in a causal series that preceded it from the infinite past and will succeed it into the infinite future. That's the picture of reality for Spinoza. Now, either way, whether they're talking about infinite modes or finite modes, they flow from God, and they flow in a way that is bound to a strictly logically determined causal determination. Hence, there are no contingent beings or events in nature, no unnecessitated events. There are no free or uncaused causes in nature. Spinoza would add to this that God is the only self-caused being and is free in a sense, but not in the sense of having free will. There is no free will. And then finally, I ran out of board here, but we might also add to this that for Spinoza, there's only efficient causality. Efficient causality, as you've already indicated, is modeled upon mathematical or logical deduction. Formal and material causality are more or less absorbed into efficient causality, and final causality is straight out denied. Spinoza calls it, in the appendix to part 1, a mistaking of effects for causes. That is, the aims or goals that final causality posits are actually effects that modes are efficiently caused to produce by the nature of God. And so to think of them as causes is to mistake effects for causes. So that's the ultimate view that he's going to have. There's only this sort of, as it were, top-down efficient causality, or bottom-up. You can think of it in the same way. If you think of it as God sort of expressing itself, manifesting itself by the things that flow up from him. But of course, it's easier to think of it as top-down because God is the highest sort of necessary reality in this picture. And there is no final causality to be had. There are no goals or aims. There's just this sort of logical deductive machine or mechanism that's churning out all of these modes as expressions or manifestations of God. All right, so that's the overall picture. Now, if we look at the Proposition 16, where we left off last time, Spinoza says, from the necessity of the divine nature, there must follow infinitely many things in infinitely many modes, i.e. everything which can fall under an infinite intellect. And he demonstrates this as follows. He says, this proposition must be plain to anyone, provided he attends to the fact that the intellect infers from the given definition of anything a number of properties that really do follow necessarily from it, that is, from the very essence of the thing, and that it infers more properties the more the definition of the thing expresses reality, that is, the more reality the essence of the defined thing involves. But since the divine nature has absolutely infinite attributes, by definition 6, each of which also expresses an essence infinite in its own kind, from its necessity there must follow infinitely many things in infinite modes, i.e. everything that can fall under an infinite intellect. So the intellect infers from the definition of anything. What kind of inference are we talking about here? I already mentioned that this is going to be a kind of a logical, deductive inference. So if you think about the definition of man as a rational animal, from this definition alone, man as a rational animal, one can infer through logical, deductive reasoning that man is rational. And that as rational, therefore, logically, by definition, man is capable of thought, man is capable of logical inference, man is capable of linguistic communication, etc., etc. Also, it follows from the definition man is a rational animal that man is an animal. And therefore, by the definition of animal, man is alive. It follows logically. Man is sentient. That follows logically. Man is capable of self-movement. Follows logically. Is capable and in need of nourishment, follows logically, etc., etc. So what Spinoza seems to be saying here is that the definition of God, remember, is substance with an infinite number of infinite modes, each of which expresses an eternal and infinite essence. And from this definition, there must follow infinitely many things in infinite modes. From God, literally everything follows by definition. So everything is going to have the status of sort of being caused, in Spinoza's sense of cause, by the fact that it logically follows from the nature of God. That's the idea. Now this appears to suggest then that it follows by a strict logical necessity, not only by efficient causality. So the truths about anything are going to be logically necessary truths, would be another way of viewing this. For anything else to follow other than what actually follows would be a logical contradiction. In the same way, it would be a contradiction to say man is a rational animal, but man is not rational, but man is not sentient. Those would be contradicting the definition. And that's the kind of necessity that Spinoza seems to be claiming. A key question here, of course, though, is what are these infinite modes? And this is what I was referring to earlier here, the infinite modes. Why in infinite modes? So let's think about this a little bit. First question we need to ask is, why should substance have modes at all? Why can't substance just exist as substance without modes? So let's remind ourselves of a few things. First of all, God is a substance, and we might just say God is substance, since there is only one, namely God. Substance is, recall, in its nature the same as its attribute or attributes. God is, by definition, infinite in its number of nature or attributes. And we know only two of these, thought and extension, because of the limitations of our human intellect. But there are infinitely many more. But we do at least have these two examples, thought and extension, from which we can begin to think about why it should follow logically that substance must manifest in modes, that substance must be modified in some way. Remember also last time we said that an attribute refers to the most general sort or type or kind of thing. Attributes are not properties so much as they're what we might call the media of a type of property. Some properties, we could say, being intelligent, occur in the medium of thought. Other properties, such as being tall, occur in the medium of extension, is a way to think about it. I said in the last video that maybe attributes can be thought of as the determinable, but in themselves indeterminate natures of things. This means that they are, in themselves, absolutely indeterminate, just taken in their own intrinsic, unmodified natures. And to see this, suppose I ask you, conceive of a thought, or conceive of an extension. Without question, you're going to have to conceive of a particular mode of thought or of extension. If I ask you to think of a thought, but I say but it can't be a thought of anything in particular, not even the thought of thought itself, you won't be able to do it. If I ask you to conceive of an extended figure, but this has to be an extended figure which has absolutely no particular shape whatsoever, you can't do it. Now, we know that anything absolutely indeterminate is as good as nothing at all. And so if thought and extension are absolutely indeterminate in their unmodified form in this way, we can conclude that an attribute must manifest or express itself in some mode or other in order to be actual. This is absolutely required. Otherwise, it's indeterminate and it's nothingness itself. It's just nothing, which is precisely the opposite of its nature, which is to be reality itself. So also in this passage I just read here, Spinoza distinguishes between things, he says, which are said to be either one, infinite in number, and two, in something else, namely, in the second distinction, infinite modes. So evidently, infinite modes are the primary reality in which attributes express themselves in a determinate way. Infinite modes are the primary reality in which attributes express themselves in a determinate way. We can get a clearer grasp of what Spinoza has in mind here by thinking about how each attribute we have knowledge of, namely thought and extension, might appear in an infinite mode as something determinate. To begin with, we keep in mind that according to Spinoza, in each infinite mode, an infinite number of things must appear. So in the infinite mode of thought, an infinite number of things must appear. The infinite mode of extension, an infinite number of things must appear. Spinoza identifies this as everything which can fall under an infinite intellect. And this suggests right away that the infinite mode in which the attribute of thought manifests itself determinately is something like the infinite intellect, namely God's mind. We might say the divine mind or the infinite intellect. Right? So the immediate infinite mode of thought would be God's mind, the infinite divine intellect. But now, of course, we need to ask the question, what's that? Right? What's this infinite intellect? Well, Spinoza suggests that it expresses everything that is the essence, infinite essences. Expresses an essence, infinitely many essences. So this suggests that it's the set of all essences. The set of all essences is what the divine intellect contains. This would be the equivalent of the set of all adequate ideas. And this idea of adequacy will be further developed later in the book. But for now, it's probably best to think of the kind of status that the ideas or the forms would have in Plato. How for a Platonist, you have the essences that have this kind of eternal perfection. And then think also about how for a Platonist, a finite human mind relates to these ideas. We have a more or less adequate comprehension of what the idea really is. That seems to be sort of what Spinoza has in mind. The ideas are really these sort of eternal essences that exist, infinite number of essences. They are essences that correspond to everything that the infinite intellect is aware of, which involves like the set of all ideas. So we might naturally expect, although it's not super clear at this point, that Spinoza is thinking of the immediate infinite mode of the attribute of thought as the divine intellect, as the set of all adequate or essential ideas, perfect ideas of real essences, or something like that. That's the infinite mode in which the attribute of thought immediately manifests itself, simply as the result of the logical necessity of its own nature, which is also a form of efficient causality for Spinoza. And the infinite things that appear in this mode are the infinite number of adequate essences or ideas of things. That's something like the Platonic sense. So the infinite series, the series as a whole, something along those lines, like here. Not the particular modes that occur within the series, but the series as a whole, the infinite series as a whole would be the immediate infinite mode of thought. All the series of ideas, which isn't a temporal series here. I don't think it's appropriate to think of it that way, but rather just something like a logical series, a logically organized series, like maybe a complete taxonomy of all of reality organized according to ideas. And of course, if all of reality is itself infinite, this is going to be infinite. So something like that idea. Admittedly, Spinoza does not give us as much explanation of this as we might like. This is a notorious problem in his in the secondary literature on Spinoza, the commentary on him. But we'll leave it at that for now. Now, what about the infinite mode in the attribute of extension? So we've just talked about the immediate infinite mode in the attribute of thought. And we said that this is something like the divine mind, the divine intellect, the set of all adequate ideas. And the immediate infinite modes would be the series of all essences that are contained within the divine mind, something like that. But now, if we apply this to the attribute of extension, how is this going to work? What's going to be the immediate infinite mode of extension and the immediate infinite mode of extension? Well, parallel to thought manifesting itself in the infinite mode of the divine intellect or mind, we should naturally conclude that God manifests itself in extension in the infinite mode of not the divine mind, but the divine body. That would be the natural thing to think, right? That's how we might suppose Spinoza conceives of the physical world as God's body. Okay, so is that right, though? Is that right? If that were the case, then the infinite things that are contained in this mode would be the infinite number of the parts of the world, somewhat parallel to the infinite number of essences that are contained in the divine mind. The problem for this view, though, is that Spinoza denies that the physical world has parts. In the Scholium to Proposition 15, Spinoza argues against the idea of God as having a body in the usual sense, insofar as that would apply a boundary to God. So if you look at the top of page 10 there, he says, not the top of page 10, but the top of the Scholium. There's the center of page 10. He says, there are those who feign a God like man, consisting of a body and a mind, and subject to passions. But how far they wander from the true knowledge of God is sufficiently established by what has already been demonstrated. Them I dismiss. For everyone who has to any extent contemplated the divine nature denies that God is corporeal, that is, bodily. They prove this best from the fact that by body, we understand any quantity with length, breadth, and depth, limited by some certain figure. Nothing more absurd than this can be said of God, namely of a being absolutely infinite. So first of all, notice something. Spinoza does believe that one of the attributes of God is extension, which means that God has length, breadth, and depth. But the problem here is this idea of limited by some certain figure. So the idea of body is more than just the idea of extension. It's the idea of extension that is limited by some boundary. And of course, it's absurd that an infinite being could be limited by any boundary. At the same time, however, he rejects the notion that God is a purely spiritual being. The arguments traditionally posed against this thesis typically refer to the idea that if God were not a purely spiritual being, if God were corporeal, then God would have to have parts, which leads to absurd consequences. And so you see these, I'm not going to read them out here, but you can see these arguments summarized at the top of page 11 in this paragraph here that has the little diagram there. He's laying out the set of arguments that these people typically make. And this is the traditional argument that God must be a spiritual being, that God can't have a body. But in reply to this, he says the following. After he summarized these arguments, he says, these are the arguments which I find authors using to try to show that corporeal substance is unworthy of the divine nature and cannot pertain to it. But anyone who is properly attentive will find that I have already replied to them, since these arguments are founded only on their supposition that corporeal substance is composed of parts, which I have already, in Proposition 12 and Proposition 13 corollary, shown to be absurd. So we talked a lot in the last video about these propositions that argue that extension, God, under the attribute of extension, is indivisible. Indivisible. In other words, we said that extension for Spinoza is a seamless garment. It's a continuum, Another corollary of this is that Spinoza rejects the atomistic view of the universe. So to picture this, you might present a couple of images. Traditional atomism views the totality of the universe as akin to a bowl of popcorn, you might say. That's sort of the Democritean kind of atomism, because there are different shapes of atoms, just as there are different shapes of popcorn. To update this, we might say that modern atomism is like a bowl of super tiny little ball bearings representing quarks, maybe, right? A bowl of ball bearings, these little particles. However, for Spinoza, the picture is different. The picture should be something like a smooth bowl of Jell-O. Hopefully everyone knows what Jell-O is. The Jell-O universe. That's Spinoza's universe of extension, I would say. Only there's no boundary, so we also need to subtract the bowl from our picture. So you have Jell-O in all directions, Jell-O above, Jell-O below, Jell-O to the left, Jell-O to the right, Jell-O in front, Jell-O in back. But we also need to subtract other features that we typically associate with Jell-O, namely bright colors and things like this. We're talking here about a colorless Jell-O and also a featureless Jell-O. Like it doesn't have Jell-O, smoothness or stickiness, of course. It doesn't have any features. And here, so a couple of immediate problems arise. Once we've subtracted all these features of Jell-O and we've subtracted the bowl, the body of God conceived in this way is still hard to distinguish from nothingness, if we want to call it a body. And again, Spinoza would deny that this is really a body, because bodies include the idea of something bounded. And second, here there's the old objection that Aristotle leveled against Parmenides, that this seems to make the universe into a static object in which there is no change. So we still are left with the problem that it seems too indeterminate if we think of just this continuum, right? To go back to the technical idea, this continuum universe without atoms, but just a continuum. It seems to be too indeterminate, and it doesn't seem to allow for the possibility of the dynamism of the universe. As we'll see later on, Spinoza explicitly rejects Parmenideanism. He wants to assert that God or nature is essentially dynamic. So even though its nature is very machine-like, it operates according to this logical necessity, churning out effects with a kind of logical rigor. It is churning out effects, at least at some level. It has this dynamic character. He calls this natura naturans. We'll come back to that. This does suggest an answer, though. The fact that he appeals to this idea of a dynamic character of nature. And this is supported by an answer he gave to one of his correspondents in a surviving letter that scholars have uncovered, that the immediate infinite mode in which extension manifests itself determinately is simply motion itself, or change itself, we might say, or what he calls in the ethics motion and rest, a kind of differential portion of motion and rest. That's the immediate infinite mode of extension, motion and rest. In a differential portion in different regions. So the idea would be that God, under the attribute of extension, is a dynamic whole, a continuum of extension whose parcels, which are not individual parts, exhibit varying degrees of motion and rest in varying proportions in different regions of space. And this will be borne out when we examine later on how Spinoza conceives of the unity of what common sense tells us are individual bodies. They're merely stable proportions of motion and rest moving through the continuum. So more on this later on. To return to our jello imagery, we need to add this is a jello which famously jiggles. That's a self-jiggling jello. And it jiggles in different proportions, different rates, in different regions of the continuum of it. I'll try to find a link to the video from an old commercial from the 70s that was the inspiration for this. Little did I know back then, as a young wee lad, that this would come in useful. But the idea is that there's this image of a jiggling jello kind of gives you a sense of what the immediate infinite mode of extension, I think, might be. Again, there's a lot of obscurity and a lot of controversy in the commentary about this, so we need to be tentative. But that gives you some extension, some idea of how the immediate infinite mode of extension might express itself. Now, how does this follow by definition from the very nature of extension, though? And this is a puzzle that the Aristotelian would use to attack the Spinozist. And we'll talk about this more when we look at the distinction between natura naturans and natura naturato later in the video. For now, let's suppose as a first stab at it that the infinite mode of extension is the dynamic whole of the continuous universe that involves regions of differential motion in a constantly changing pattern. We might even suppose that since it's infinite, it's inclusive of all possible patterns of differential motion and change throughout the continuum. Historically, this is called the principle of plenitude, although Spinoza doesn't explicitly call it this, but the idea that all possibilities are realized in nature. All possible. I mean, if you're an atomist, you talk about all possible combinations of atoms. But since Spinoza is not an atomist, you have to talk about all the possible patterns of differential motion in the universe, in the continuum. One notable difference between the infinite mode of thought, the divine mind containing the set of all ideas, and the infinite mode of extension, the dynamic continuum of extended change of motion, is the role of time in each. In thought, the divine mind is represented as static and outside time, as I describe it as kind of a logical structure. Whereas in extension, God is dynamic and ceaselessly unfolding in time. So that's an interesting asymmetry between the two. Now, there are complications to this. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it, especially when we talk about aspects of Spinoza's theory of mind and the relation to body. Some of these issues will come up again. But now in Proposition 17, Spinoza concludes that God acts from the laws of his nature alone and is compelled by no one. The demonstration says, we have just shown, Proposition 16, that from the necessity of the divine nature alone, or what is the same thing, from the laws of his nature alone, absolutely infinite things follow. And in Proposition 15, we have demonstrated that nothing can be or be conceived without God, but that all things are in God. So there can be nothing outside him by which he is determined or compelled to act. Therefore, God acts from the laws of his nature alone and is compelled by no one, QED. In other words, God's only law is its own nature or its own definition. It's not causally influenced from outside itself in any way at all. In Corollary 1, Spinoza calls this law the perfection, that is the absolute self-sufficiency and completeness, lacking in nothing, the perfection of God's being. In Corollary 2, Spinoza defines God as the only free cause. That is to say that God and only God satisfies definition 7, which says, this is back on page 2, that thing is called free, which exists from the necessity of its nature alone and is determined to act by itself alone. So it's not that God is uncaused, but rather that God is caused by its nature alone and not by anything else, logically determined by its nature alone and not by anything outside of its nature. Now, Spinoza is going to go on to distinguish this sort of freedom, the freedom of being determined only by one's own nature, from the sort of freedom that people are typically talking about when they refer to the notion of free will. So there is a place for freedom in Spinoza, but not for free will. For Spinoza, God does not have free will, at least not in the way that people ordinarily suppose. Although God can be viewed as a free cause, that doesn't mean that God has free will. So we need to make that important distinction. Certainly, God for Spinoza does not have the ability to arbitrarily create whatever it wants. Rather, for Spinoza, God could only create or cause one world, namely this one, because this one is the one that expresses its nature, and so is the only possible one. So if you look on page 14, the scholium there, in the first paragraph, he says, others think that God is a free cause because he can, so they think, bring it about that the things which we have said follow from his nature do not happen or are not produced by him. But this is the same as if we were to say that God can bring it about that it would not follow from the nature of a triangle that its 3 angles are equal to 2 right angles, or that from a given cause the effect would not follow, which is absurd. So there's this idea, which goes back to William of Ockham and Descartes, we call the Ockhamite or Cartesian idea, of what Spinoza will call here an absolute will. This is the notion of a God whose will is absolute and is bound by nothing, including even the laws of logic, even its own nature. And this is a kind of super emphasis on God's omnipotence. So God can do absolutely anything, even things that are logically impossible, even things that contradict his own nature. And God has just decided. I mean, if God only acts in accordance with his own nature, according to this Ockhamite Cartesian view, then that's because that's what God has decided. But God could have decided to act against its nature. There's nothing that God cannot do. But as Spinoza suggests here, the whole idea that God could change the properties of a triangle is absurd and impossible. He notes, as Spinoza does, that one objection that a Cartesian would raise against Spinoza is that Spinoza limits God to only creating what he actually created by denying that he could have done otherwise. And this seems to be a quite clear limitation on God's omnipotence and freedom. And Spinoza's reply is as follows here. This is the second to last paragraph on page 14. He says, but I think I have shown clearly enough, see proposition 16, that from God's supreme power or infinite nature, infinite many things and infinite many modes, that is, all things, have necessarily flowed or always follow by the same necessity and in the same way as from the nature of a triangle. It follows from eternity into eternity that its 3 angles are equal to 2 right angles. So God's omnipotence has been actual from eternity and will remain in the same actuality to eternity. And from this way, at least in my opinion, God's omnipotence is maintained far more perfectly. Now, exactly what this means is open to debate, and I hope we will discuss this. But one thing I want to highlight here is that this passage, as well as with others, makes crystal clear the way in which God causally determines the world. In other words, God causally determines the world by the same sort of logical necessity as the properties of a triangle follow from its definition. So we have here a clear statement of this kind of strong logical necessitarianism. Even so, we might ask why God should be bound by logic. Why? Why should God be bound by logic? And this is a very live question within the history of Christianity, at least. In the Lutheran tradition particularly, this has been denied. It's been denied that God is bound by logic. It cannot simply be assumed. And of course, as I said, William of Ockham and Descartes suggest similar ideas. In a famous controversy, a philosopher of the late 18th century named Friedrich Jacobi argued that Spinoza was right, that logically God has to be necessitated and cannot have free will. But this fellow Jacobi, and that's spelled Jacobi, so you can Google him. You'd probably be better off if you Google pantheism controversy. Or if you read this book by Friedrich Beiser, The Fate of Reason, the first 3 chapters. Beiser is an excellent writer. This is an award-winning book, a very good reading. You can read it on your next flight after the COVID. Where there's this live argument about what should we choose, religion or reason, because it seems like reason leads to Spinozism, and Spinozism is not acceptable. So we should just say that, well, God doesn't have to abide by logic. And this was an idea that was very influential on Søren Kierkegaard and so on. So this leads us to our first discussion question, because I think we really need to ask, and here's the question: by what right does Spinoza assume that God cannot bring about things that go against his own nature? If God is truly omnipotent, why must he be bound by the laws of logic? Isn't it a limitation on God's power to say that he could create only the actual world, i.e. only what he actually brought about and nothing more or nothing else? Isn't it a limitation that he has to be bound by the laws of human thought? By what right does Spinoza assume that the laws of logic, which may be seen as just the laws of human thought, are the laws of God's nature in the first place? So that's the first discussion question. By what right does Spinoza assume that God cannot bring about things that go against his own nature? If God's truly omnipotent, why must he be bound by the laws of logic? Isn't it a limitation on God's power that he could create only the actual world? Isn't it a limitation that he has to be bound by the laws of thought? By what right does Spinoza assume that the laws of logic are laws of God's nature in the first place? Now, in the second scholium that begins on page 15, Spinoza argues that it's false to attribute either intellect or will to God. Thus, the picture of God as a person weighing his options, choosing among, should I destroy Sodom and Gomorrah or not? I don't know, right? Choosing among possibilities on the basis of his reasoned or arbitrary choice. Okay, Abraham, if you could find 10 just men, I won't destroy them, right? That picture is, for Spinoza, an anthropomorphic projection. God doesn't have that kind of freedom. God doesn't have that kind of intellect. God doesn't have that kind of will. So here he discusses the intellect in some detail, leaving the will for a little later. And this leads up to some other additional interesting questions to discuss. We understand intellect for Spinoza from our own nature. But God's intellect cannot be like ours, not just because ours differs in degree of power or degree of its content or something, but because its relation to its objects is radically different. And the basic difference is this: our relation to the objects of our intellect is posterior. That is to say, our intellect has to conform itself to objects in order to know objects. Objects come before the intellect. Our intellect approaches objects with questions and seeks to learn about them. By contrast, God's intellect is prior to the objects of its intellect. God is the cause of things. So you might say when God thinks of the essence of a thing, they're brought into being. Some of you familiar with Kant might recognize that this is the origin of this notion of intellectual intuition in Kant. Not that Spinoza is, but it's the same kind of idea. That God's act of knowing is also the act of creating, bringing into existence. So this is a radical difference. God's intellect is prior to the objects. God thinks things into existence. Whereas for human beings, things already exist prior, and our intellect has to know them, has to conform itself to them. Moreover, God's intellect is also the cause of our intellect. And this gives Spinoza a general argument against the notion that they're anything alike. If you look at the bottom of 15, he says, so the thing that is the cause both of the essence and of the existence of some effect must differ from such an effect, both as to its essence and to its existence. But God's intellect is the cause both of the essence and of the existence of our intellect. Therefore, God's intellect, insofar as it is conceived to constitute the divine essence, differs from our intellect both as to its essence and as to its existence, and cannot agree with it in anything except in name, as we supposed. Note that Spinoza here is asserting that intellect, the word intellect, is an equivocal term in the scholastic sense. That it's used in different contexts in which it doesn't mean the same thing. And this leads us to the second discussion question. The second discussion question is, a scholastic like Thomas Aquinas would claim that there is a sense in which we can attribute intellect and will, and therefore personhood, to God. How would a Thomist reply to an objection like Spinoza's? What are the strengths and weaknesses of their respective positions? So the second discussion question is that a scholastic like Thomas Aquinas would claim that there's a sense in which we can attribute intellect and will, and therefore personhood, to God. How would a Thomist reply to an objection like Spinoza's, which says that intellect and will don't mean the same thing when we apply them to God? It's just the same name, but we're not referring to the same thing. What are the strengths and weaknesses of their respective positions? Okay. So now I'm going to take some clusters of propositions and summarize them together once we've laid this foundation. It's possible to do this. First, in propositions 18 through 22, Spinoza makes the following points. First, that God is the immanent and not the transitive cause of all things. That's proposition 18. Remember, that was the point I made here. That is to say that God doesn't stand outside of things as an external cause, but rather things are caused as expressions or modifications of God. So therefore God is the immanent, not the transitive cause. God and his attributes, or we should say its attributes for Spinoza, are eternal. And the basic idea behind this conclusion is that logical truths have no duration. They're true for all times. And so God and its attributes, God's natures, have the status of a logical, eternal truth. Propositions 21 and 22 really concern these immediate and mediate infinite modes and their relations. And what he tries to show is that the immediate and mediate infinite modes must be distinguished from each other, but both must share in the eternity of God itself. And the basic idea here is that since God, by definition, is eternal and infinite, and as we argued earlier, God needs to become determinate in order to be actual, and because God needs to express itself in the immediate and mediate infinite modes in order to become determinate, as we tried to show earlier, then the infinite modes must logically be eternal as well. Otherwise, God wouldn't be eternal. That's the basic idea. So this creates a kind of a sharp divide here between God as substance, God's attributes, the immediate and mediate infinite modes of God, all of which are eternal, and this third layer here, the bottom level of causality, if you're imagining top-down causality here as our picture, the finite modes, the particular things. In propositions 24 through 29, Spinoza introduces the finite modes, which, as I've said, correspond to particular things. He says, on the top of 19, particular things are nothing but affections of God's attributes, or modes by which God's attributes are expressed in a certain and determinate way. This demonstration is evident from proposition 15 and 5, he says. Particular finite modes, unlike the infinite modes, do not flow directly from God's nature, and there's a reason for this. If they did, they would be eternal. So if you look at the demonstration of proposition 28 on page 19, he says, this is the second sentence there in the demonstration to proposition 28. But what is finite and has a determinate existence could not have been produced by an absolute nature of an attribute of God, for whatever follows from the absolute nature of an attribute of God is eternal and infinite. So particular things are by nature non-eternal. They only exist for a limited duration. Your body, for example, or your mind, in an infinite causal series that includes the particular mode that produced it and the particular mode that it produces. So this becomes clear if you just look at what the content of proposition 28 contains. He says, every singular thing, that is every particular thing, or anything which is finite and has a determinate existence, can neither exist nor be determined to produce an effect unless it is determined to exist and produce an effect by another cause, which is also finite and has a determinate existence. Right? So it's not produced directly by God, but it's produced by another antecedent finite cause, which has a determinate existence. And again, this cause, this antecedent cause that produced the first thing we were talking about, can neither exist nor be determined to produce an effect unless it is determined to exist and produce an effect by another, which is also finite and has a determinate existence, and so on to infinity. So that's where we get this picture here of a causal series where one mode that's a determinate particular thing produces another, produces another, produces another. That's the causal chain of determinate things, each of which has a finite duration. It goes on through existence. We'll talk more about sort of what these modes actually involve. There are a lot of complexities, but just for now, that's the basic picture. That these things are sort of modifications of the mediate infinite modes. For example, modifications of the series of God's essences, ideas in God's mind, or of the continuum that has these differential patterns of motion and change and rest and so on. That's what's going on here. So these are modifications of these infinite things. They further modify the infinite modes. But they modify them in a way that is explicable by seeing each finite mode is caused by another preceding in an infinite series. Still, these things are bound by a logical necessity as well, because, first of all, they're bound by laws. So, for example, laws of psychology or laws of physics that Spinoza has shown are logically necessary consequences of God's nature. So, the laws of, in extension, the laws of motion and rest, whatever they are. Of course, it's an empirical matter what these are, right? But there will be some laws, some necessary laws of motion and rest that follow by necessity from God's nature. And within just to stick with the mode of attribute of extension here, or the infinite mode of it, the wiggling jello that goes on to infinity, everything that's going to happen there is going to be determined with absolute causal airtightness by these laws, whatever they may be. So within the infinite modes, there are no exceptions to these laws. All of these modes are going to follow. These arrows are in no way going to be arbitrary or occur by chance. They're all going to be determined by whatever the laws are that govern the infinite mode of that attribute. In the final propositions of part one, Spinoza draws out the consequences of proposition 29, which serves as kind of a linchpin of the system. Proposition 29 says, in nature there is nothing contingent, but all things have been determined from the necessity of the divine nature to exist and produce an effect in a certain way. So there's nothing contingent. If you look at the scholium to Proposition 33, he says there, scholium 1 rather, page 22, he wants to explain, he says, what I understand by contingent. For a thing's existence follows necessarily either from its essence or definition or from a given efficient cause. And a thing is also called impossible from these same causes. Namely, either because of its essence or definition, either because its essence or its definition involves a contradiction, or because there is no external cause from what has been determined to produce such a thing. So, something is contingent when it is not necessary. And it's necessary if it follows, if it would be a logical contradiction for the opposite to have occurred. That's the idea. So everything is necessary in that sense. Nothing is, strictly speaking, contingent. Now, what he will go on to say is that there is a kind of contingency which is not an ontological notion, namely a kind of exception to this rigid logical determinism, but rather is an epistemological notion, where he says on the top of 23, a thing is called contingent only because of a defect of our knowledge. So sometimes we call something contingent because we don't know, we can't see that it follows by logical necessity. But Spinoza believes that he's proven here that nevertheless it does, and it's just the limitation of our intellect that keeps us from seeing this. So in the final propositions of part 1, Spinoza draws out the consequences of this proposition that there is no contingency, everything is absolutely logically necessary, for the question of the possibility of freedom of the will. And to set up this discussion, there's this extremely important scholium to Proposition 29, the bottom of 20 and page 21 in our text, where he distinguishes between natura naturans and natura naturata. Which is literally nature naturing versus nature natured. So this is what he says at the bottom of 20 there. He says, before I proceed further, I wish to explain here, rather to advise, what we must understand by natura naturans and natura naturata. For from the preceding, I think it is already established that by natura naturans, we must understand what is in itself and conceived through itself, or such attributes of substance as express in eternal and infinite essence. That is, God, insofar as God is conceived as a free cause. So this is God qua free cause. That's natura naturans. Okay. But by natura naturata, I understand whatever follows from the necessity of God's nature or from any of God's attributes. That is, all the modes of God's attributes insofar as they are considered as things which are in God and can neither be nor be conceived without God. So this is sort of the, we might say, the effects of God's nature. Right? This is the effects of God's nature. And that suggests then that the relationship here is one of cause and effect. This is sort of nature as a productive force. Right? Nature as producing forces, Mother Nature, that nature. Whereas this is nature as a product, as a collection of things, as a biosphere or whatever, or a universe. That kind of idea when we try to encapsulate in our minds nature, not thinking of nature as its production through laws and its sort of dynamic, fluctuating character, but we think of nature as the products produced right? So we might also add this as sort of like nature as producer versus nature as product, roughly speaking. That's the distinction between natura naturans and natura naturata. Okay, so the immediate application of this distinction for Spinoza is to drive a wedge between the notion of God as a creative, self-caused, absolute causal determinant of all of its affections, and the notion of God as a creative being possessing free exercise of the will. What Spinoza is going to want to say is that the notion of will, so if we draw our line here between these two, the notion of will is solidly on this side of the divide. And God's freedom is on this side of the divide. So there is no freedom that applies to the will. And therefore there is no free will. That's the point he wants to make. He wants to drive this wedge here between freedom and will, so as to deny that there's any free will even with God. So in Proposition 30, he says, an actual intellect, whether finite or infinite, must comprehend God's attributes and God's affections and nothing else. In Proposition 31, he says, the actual intellect, whether finite or infinite, like will, desire, love, and the like, must be referred to natura naturata, not to natura naturans. In other words, will belongs to God conceived in this way, the second way, the passive side, so to speak. And then Proposition 32, the will cannot be called a free cause, but only a necessary one. And then in the demonstration of 32 there, he goes on to explain this. He says, the will, like the intellect, is only a certain mode of thinking. And so, each volition can neither exist nor be determined to produce an effect unless it is determined by another cause, and this cause again, and so on to infinity. So I've erased it now, but that causal series, right, that includes the chain of M's causing M's causing M's causing modes, and the will is just one of those, right? Whereas that's lower on the causal food chain, so to speak. It's a lower causal consequence of God's ultimate nature, whereas God's freedom, God is a free cause, is at the top. And wills are just an effect of this higher sense of freedom, namely the freedom that God has to determine everything in accordance with its own nature by an absolute logical necessity. But that is not an exercise of will. And that has to do with the way in which Spinoza is conceiving of the will, of course. And you notice here, he's essentially subsuming the will under the intellect. So he describes here an actual intellect. And by this he means a product of nature that issues in determinate thoughts. For example, in the finite intellect, there's this thought, I will choose chocolate rather than vanilla ice cream. That thought is merely a finite affection of God. And so this has to be determined by another finite mode of the same kind that precedes it. And, for example, the thought, I've had both vanilla and chocolate and I prefer chocolate. That was the thought that preceded the thought, I will choose chocolate rather than vanilla ice cream, right? But then that thought, I've in the past preferred chocolate to vanilla, that was preceded by some thought. And I'm simplifying here. There are many complexities with regard to the causal relationship between thoughts and all of these things. But just for the sake of this problem, I'm greatly oversimplifying and perhaps even saying things that are strictly speaking wrong. But just to give you a sense of how Spinoza is conceiving of the intellect here, the intellect basically resides in, the will rather. The will is basically a kind of modification of the intellect. And from this kind of example, Spinoza concludes that there's no freedom of the will here. There's just a causal chain of a series of thoughts. That's all there is to the will. The will is a finite effect of finite causes in an infinite series of such causes, all of which ultimately flows from strict necessity from God's own nature. Not even God has free will. The effects that flow from God flow from its nature, not its will. Moreover, the idea of a free will involves the ability to do otherwise, But if we read Proposition 33, we see Spinoza arguing, things could have been produced by God in no other way and in no other order than they have been produced. Demonstration. For all things have necessarily followed from God's given nature, by Proposition 16, and have been determined from the necessity of God's nature to exist and produce an effect in a certain way. Therefore, if things could have been of another nature, or could have been determined to produce an effect in another way, so that the order of nature was different, right? That would be, as it were, making a separate choice. It would involve a different causal series, right? He concludes from that, well, then God's nature could have also been other than it is now. And therefore, by Proposition 11, that other nature would also have had to exist. And consequently, there could have been two or more gods, which is absurd. So things could have been produced in no other way and in no other order, and so on. In other words, since God's nature is fixed and unchanging and eternal, and the causal series in the world flows logically from God's nature, it is as unchangeable as God's nature itself is. And so there is no free choice, no free will. Now, it's true that, and we'll have more to say about the will and when we get into Spinoza's philosophy of the human being and so on, but that will have to suffice for now. Now, it's true that, again, we sometimes think that things are contingent or could have been otherwise, but remember, this is an epistemic concept, not a metaphysical one. As he says in the top of 23 there, where I was reading before, for if we do not know that the thing's essence involves a contradiction, or we do not know very well that its essence does not involve a contradiction, and nevertheless can affirm nothing certainly about its existence, because the order of causes is hidden from us, it can never seem to us either necessary or impossible, so we call it contingent or possible. Right? So this is just an epistemic notion. We don't see the contradiction in me choosing vanilla ice cream, but that's only because my knowledge of the causes of my thoughts is very imperfect. That's a rough idea. Now, in the appendix, Spinoza claims that this picture of necessity refutes the notion of final causes as well. If you read through the appendix, you'll see some more details about how Spinoza thinks the errors of final causes, the error, I should say, of the notion of a final cause, arose in the first place. And how he thinks getting rid of it is a great thing that will rid mankind of many false prejudices and superstitions. You can read very much the spirit of the Enlightenment in his account. Personally, I think the kinds of stories that he presents there about the origin of religious ideas and so on are rather laughable. Kind of very put it this way, it's an aspect of Enlightenment theory of religion that hasn't aged very well. Very crude, but so I'm not going to comment on it. I have no reason to heap my scorn on what Spinoza says there. You may find it convincing. But the important point is, I think, what he says on page 27, which that he claims, and I'll let you think about this on your own, that this is the last 5 lines of page 27, nature has no end set before it, and that all final causes are nothing but human fictions. For I believe I've already sufficiently established it, both by the foundations and causes from which I have shown this prejudice to have its origin, and also by Proposition 16, 32 Corollary 1 and Corollary 2, and all those propositions by which I've shown that all things proceed by a certain internal necessity of nature with the greatest perfection. So the point here is really, he thinks he's proven that because of the nature of reality, if you buy his definitions, which he takes to be real definitions, and his axioms, everything follows by one form of causation, namely this kind of logical determination, that there's no place in this world, so to speak, for final causes. Or actually, I think more strictly speaking, you'd have to say that anything that could be construed as a final cause for Spinoza would have to be viewed as a logical consequent, and therefore as the effect of an efficient cause, and not as a final cause. That's his position. Okay, this leads us to the third discussion question. Are you convinced by Spinoza's argument against freedom of the will? Why or why not? What consequences, for example, philosophical, ethical, political, social, and religious consequences do you think follow for one who accepts Spinoza's view? So, third discussion question, are you convinced by Spinoza's argument against freedom of the will? Why or why not? What consequences do you think follow for one who accepts Spinoza's view?